We bombed Hiroshima, we bombed Nagasaki, and we nuked far more than the thousands in New York and the Pentagon, and we never batted an eye. We have supported state terrorism against the Palestinians and black South Africans, and now we are indignant because the stuff we have done overseas is now brought right back into our own front yards. America's chickens are coming home to roost.
Welcome back. Joining us is Dr. Claire Spencer, the head of the Middle East Studies at the Royal Institute of International Relations. Dr. Spencer, we've heard that, and he was basically put aside by candidate Obama. What's wrong with what he said? The chickens are coming home to roost. In our field, we call it blowback, and there's been blowback to American foreign policy.
Well, certainly from the Middle East, but it was something that was discussed quite a lot at the beginning of the campaign, and then notably as the economic crisis took over, certainly the fallout from Iraq has faded away from the campaign, and I think the candidates fell back in a sense because they're very conscious of voting strengths on not quite platitudes but sort of easy statements about the Middle East. In other words, Iraq wasn't mentioned so much, the suffering, particularly of US soldiers. Don't forget, this was very much an issue domestically within the US. The future for Israel-Palestine, well, I don't think there's much they can say on this, given that at the moment we don't have a functioning Israeli government. The Palestinians, as we know, are split down the middle. Iraq, the future depends very much on the State of Forces agreement, which has to be concluded actually by the end of the year to continue with the UN mandate and so on. So I think these issues obviously will have to be grappled with in January, but there's not much that can be moved on any of them at the moment.
But my concern, Striker Maguire, is there is an attempt to distance, for Obama, to distance himself from this rhetoric, which basically says we are to blame for a good number of problems around the world, including some of it that created that blowback, hence 9/11.
It's 9/11. I mean, it's an iconic moment that Obama knows that if he touches it in the wrong way, it could have had a big effect on his campaign. I think he addressed it quite well in a speech in Philadelphia in March, when he spent a lot of time talking about Reverend Wright, talking about manifestations of African American anger and how it can come out even in church and so on and so forth. I think he dealt with it very well, so well that he said himself the other day that he was quite I can't remember his exact words, but he basically said he was quite impressed by the fact that McCain had not brought up Reverend Wright at the end of the campaign.
But is that convincing? I wasn't convinced by Obama. I thought it was all rhetoric. But at the end of the day, he didn't really address what Reverend Wright was talking about, which is that we really haven't been good out there around the world. In fact, for a century of muscular intervention around the world, America didn't behave well. And that's what Reverend Wright was trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously, from from the electoral point of view in America, he couldn't possibly sign up to such a program, whether it's right or wrong. Yeah. So, I mean, both for the racialized discourse that entailed, but also for the reasons that he himself is going to be managing these foreign wars and interventions around the world, he can't possibly, as at the heart of the American establishment, sign up to such a series of lines. I mean, you know, America will continue to have troops in 130 out of 195 countries in the world. It'll be continuing to fight the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, there's obviously going to be some change, but it's not going to be in the fundamentals. I mean, he will still be at the head of the most powerful state in the world, overwhelmingly the most powerful military force in the world, as you said earlier, that there's ever been. And, you know, he, from his own electoral point of view and his own relations with other parts of the American government that he's about to enter into the heart of, he couldn't possibly go along with that. He had to distance himself from it, and I think, you know, people understand that around the world.
What's worse, Tariq, is that he went beyond that during the elections and said the best way to fight our war in Afghanistan is that we might have to go in and bombard parts in Pakistan to go after Al-Qaeda. And hence, perhaps he's giving now the excuse for the likes of Secretary of State Gates and General Petraeus to expand the war in Afghanistan into Pakistan.
I think that was a very irresponsible thing for him to say. And I think one reason he possibly said it, I hope that is the reason, that having come out against the war in Iraq, he thought he better be muscular on the other war the United States was engaged in. Certainly, I think that most of his advisors would warn against such a step, because were the war really to be expanded into Pakistan, it would completely destabilize that country, possibly split the Pakistani military, and then all bets are off. But Marwan, just to come back to the point you raised initially, I mean, I think one should point out that it's not just the Reverend Wright who was saying these things. I mean, 8 months before 9/11, Chalmers Johnson, a very distinguished figure in the American academic establishment and a former CIA consultant, actually wrote a book called Blowback, saying that a lot of the things we had done abroad were coming back to haunt us, and he actually warned there might be a terrorist attack. It's just that Wright, of course, said it in a very incendiary way, whereas Chalmers Johnson said it calmly and in a level-headed way. But I think Seamus is right. For an American Democratic Party politician to come even close to that would have been to commit suicide.
Dr. Spencer, Claire, Iraq. We spoke earlier about how President Obama might pull combat troops. But what about the rest of the 100 or so thousand troops? What about the 150,000 private contractors? What about the million or so Iraqi dead? What about the millions of displaced? What is President Obama to do about Iraq?
Well, I think he may well try and disassociate himself from the very ugly past, which, as I said earlier, has been picked over the last 5 years, actually to say, look, we need to get out of here constructively. And I think one of the key issues which is not yet been settled is the issue of permanent bases for the US in Iraq, where they're going to be, whether in the Kurdish area, whether indeed it makes sense. I mean, for outsiders...
And you think President Obama would support permanent bases in Iraq?
I think he will be advised by the military leadership. I think the reason that Petraeus is there and will stay there is that he is seen as a successful general. And I think Obama will want to, if you like, liaise much more closely with him, be associated with success in Iraq, and actually trade on the fact that he was against this war and he is doing what he can to make this end successfully.
Actually, he's said that he wouldn't countenance permanent bases, but I think the problem is that the term permanent bases is very misleading.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have indefinite bases. I mean, are the bases in Britain permanent or indefinite? Are the ones in Korea, South Korea, permanent or indefinite? It's a play on words. I mean, it's clearly the American military is committed to staying in Iraq in one form or another, but it's quite easy to say these bases will not be permanent, because who can ever gainsay that?
Yes, exactly.
Stryker, you know, as an American commentator here in the States, and you look at this from, you can see both sides, if you will, of the geography. Do you think America is hanging its dirty laundry on Obama? Now that there's a mess, you take it, you deal with it?
I think more that what's happening, it's a case of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I think the world looks at Obama and they see this beautiful president that will be good for them, and I think that is a danger. And
you think it's misleading?
Well, I think it's just wrong, because he can only do so much, and the fact is, the same is true within the United States. Expectations will be very, very high.
But I'm curious, Scott, about something very particular. I'm not so much about the nitty-gritties, about the micro policies, but will he at least frame America's priorities and strategy different from President Bush?
He has tried.
Will he look at evil and good, good and bad, you know, axis of evil, the terrorist states? Is he going to have at least that kind of framework of mind?
I'd be willing to bet that he does not use the phrase axis of evil because of the echoes. But I do think he will talk. I think he will talk more about values, and he will try to sound less militaristic. But at the same time, you know, as we've been talking about, American troops are in scores and scores of countries. It's not like he's suddenly going to pull them back.
But are we sounding negative,
No, I think we're sounding very realistic and level-headed. Yeah, I mean,
but he did promise to pull troops from Iraq.
He has promised that, and expectations are high. And I think what he has to be careful about is that his own base, which has propelled him to power, is very volatile.
But he wants
and
also
if he
to talk to Iran.
doesn't do it, Marwan, if he doesn't do it, his second term might not be secure. So the more right-wing Democrats will tell him, look, McCain got 55 million votes, you can't ignore that, and therefore we have to proceed cautiously. But I hope he realizes that he has to institute some changes, both domestically, in terms of the economic slump and the economy, some semi-New Deal changes and a New Deal abroad, that if he doesn't do anything, he can't be assured he'll win again.
How about a suggestion? How about if he starts by, for example, applying the Baker-Hamilton recommendations to Iraq?
Well, that could be a start, and it's also what I was going to say in relation to what Tariq's just said is that the leeway for the US to initiate anything brand new in the Middle East is actually very constrained. The Middle East has changed significantly in the last 5 years. You see much more activism, not just from the famous sub-state actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., around the region, the role that we all know that Iran is playing. But also the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, there are others, even the French, have been involved, for example, in preempting anything the US has done vis-à-vis places like Syria. They're bringing them back into the fold. Even the Israelis, depending on what the new government decides to do, are talking to the Syrians. Now, I think the US reluctantly will have to fit into this rather than actually say, we're back, we're doing something new, and everybody fall into line.
Dr. Spencer,
I think those days are over.
Hold your thought. Right after the break, we're going to talk about Israel and the Arabs and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Right after the break.